My name's Ross Buckley. I'm the KPMG Law KWM Professor of Disruptive Innovation at UNSW, and it's my great pleasure today to introduce my very good friend and colleague and co-author, Professor Dirk Zetzsche of the University of Luxembourg. Dirk has come all this way. He's the ADA Chair in Financial Law and Inclusive Finance in Luxembourg. Far more importantly, he's a member of the world-leading team of researchers on FinTech, RegTech, cryptocurrencies, blockchain, and all that stuff. Dirk Zetzsche, myself, and Doug Arner of Hong Kong University work together all the time. Dirk is out here principally to try and get our latest book over the line and finished, but one of the benefits is we also get this presentation from him. I think it was advertised as one topic. It's sort of got a related title. It's now the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. He'll explain what that's about and have fun. Over to Dirk.
Thank you very much, Ross, for the kind introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, the times are troubling indeed. The times are troubling, but mankind is not without hope because we have transformed one of the problem childs of the world, the financial system, into our best tool to address the woes of today. I will try to make the argument in the next 30 minutes or so that something that was very unlikely to help us has indeed come to our assistance in the permanent series of crises, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's the Ukraine conflict or sustainability issues that we're facing today. I will structure my presentation in 5 steps. I will start with the evolution of the financial system and financial technology in this context. The next step will be a view on how the financial system has been started to be used in the next years. Can you please put it away because I watched that in my slides. Thank you. And then we will continue with the prerequisite for a financial system that we use as a crisis management tool before we will conclude with some thesis. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not sure how much you know about financial technology, but usually financial technology is associated with ABCD. ABCD stands for 4 types of technologies that were transformative in the field of finance, and each of them have certain use cases which you may best associate with something that you know. For instance, crowdfunding. Crowdfunding, of course, is not such a technology, but it rests on certain technology, in particular in the field of algorithms. Then the cloud, of course, because you need the server access. You have then also the data stored. Another aspect, which is often related to FinTech, is when you look at platforms like Amazon or Ant Financial, they have payment devices built in their platforms. That is, of course, a very, very strong change of the financial system, which 10, 15 years ago knew as the most modern feature, maybe the ATM, the automated teller machine. So today you have basically access to banking everywhere. Many of you here in the room or have their cell phones. Right now, you may write messages to your friends or just make a transaction. That depends on what you want to use the cell phone for. You have access to the financial system from everywhere. In the past, it was just in the bank department, in the bank office. Another aspect which is often associated with FinTech is, of course, that the speed of the financial decision has entirely changed. In the past, it took weeks to make certain crucial transactions. Maybe a cross-border wire from Europe to Australia took several days and cost fortune. Meanwhile, we have brought down the cost and the speed has increased. That means, for instance, that transactions can be booked within at least regional payment systems within a couple of seconds. That is transformative because every second that we spare means you have less counterparty risk, you need less collateral, and that will, of course, reduce transaction costs. So the FinTech system has indeed led to an entirely different world, and it rests on technologies. And these technologies I want to introduce just with a few words. Algorithms or artificial intelligence, regardless of how you want to call it, is actually something not limited to FinTech. An algorithm is just a structured way to come to a solution. Artificial intelligence is a bit more advanced to the extent that the machines learn from data patterns with which we train them. That happens, for instance, when you look at me, and when you want to distinguish between a male or female, you can train the machine to look at a bit of a darker skin around the chin, and then the machine would indicate with a great likelihood that this is a male. Yeah? And so we can train the machine to identify features which human beings have identified. And that is, of course, then a more advanced way of algorithm. But the pure magic starts when the machine finds these patterns in itself. And this is what we call machine learning. So the machine basically sifts through a major data set just to identify what makes a male a male. So we know it's maybe the chin, but maybe there are features which mankind has just not seen with an open eye, but just implicitly. And so the machine finds now all these patterns simply by sifting through millions and millions and millions of data sets. And in fact, identifying male female was one of the first patterns with which machines were trained. And so we know their machines are now meanwhile pretty good at. Another aspect which we often hear about is big data. You already heard that the respective machines sift through data set, and for that we need to collect data. And that is really impressive. The amount of data we are collecting has been growing tremendously in the last 25 years. And all of you contributed to that. I see here so many cell phones in the room. That means all of you are data generators, and these data will later be used for these type of pattern searches by our machines. The third aspect is the cloud. The cloud comes in many different ways. Maybe the least obvious ones, but probably extremely important in the field of FinTech is cryptocurrencies. Cryptocurrencies rests usually on decentralized applications, which use some type of server power, which is entirely decentralized around the world. And the cloud is, of course, not the cloud in the heaven. It's very much the cloud on the servers by having connected servers. And so the kind of cryptocurrency phenomenon that we have in the world, and right now, of course, with a lot of crisis, that, of course, rests on decentralized server access to a certain extent. And that is what we refer to as cloud. Of course, the cloud has also many other applications, but this is in the field of finance a very important one. And then last but not least, distributed ledgers. Distributed ledger is actually a very ancient phenomenon. We have it in the Rhine, the stone money of some neighboring islands here already several hundred years ago, because it is just a decentralized way of storing data. So for instance, we all in the room could remember a certain picture. And when we agree, for instance, on the eye color of one of these people on the picture together collectively, and we found as a majority it is brown eye, then we would define this is brown eye. And this is how a distributed ledger works in technology. We have so many different computers, and what is saved on the majority of these computers is being seen as correct. And the idea behind that is this way: it is much harder to corrupt data being stored, which is very, very important to build a trust on data. Because, you know, it's so easy to just press delete when you have your computer. Yeah? And so against this data corruption and manipulation, distributed ledger is the best means we have. So all of that together then looks like that. Yeah. So this is a decentralized ledger with several data sets that look for majority. Of course, 4 is not good because it's an even number and there's not ensured that we have a majority. So distributed ledgers tend to be uneven numbers for that reason. So, ladies and gentlemen, FinTech in this regard is characterized by 4 major trends. There's on the one hand, the digitalization, which is very obvious because things don't happen on paper anymore, similar to the presentation today. Then we have the decentralization. Things happen all over the globe. So it's not just a team of authors that is decentralized in the world of today, but also the world of financial transactions. Yeah? So we could, for instance, imagine that clearing and settlement is taking place on all the continents of the world simultaneously. And there's some advantage to that. When you start thinking of it, usually settlement was in the past limited to banking hours. When you have a decentralized system all over the world, you can settle literally everywhere, anytime on the planet. And that means the settlement risk is diminished significantly. Disintermediation, when everyone is somehow a banking center or a data generator, like with the cell phones in the room, then we don't need intermediaries anymore. So that of course means that maybe more noise is in the data set that we generate, but it also means that more data are available. Maybe we find in the end that the noise is not noise. And this is exactly what happens now in finance. We have more and more players coming in, which are not traditional banking players. For instance, the large shopping platforms, but also increasingly of course, players just from the tech sector. I'm not sure whether you're aware of it, but for instance, telecom operators provide the major part of the payments transaction in Africa today. These are telco operators. These have nothing to do with finance originally, but this shows that the traditional banking intermediary, the brick and mortar fortress-like institution, that is gone. And instead, we have a number of new players which are highly agile and highly flexible, but maybe also highly unreliable, as we know, for instance, from a number of crises that they come. And no, it is our time and our task to find the right balance in between. Well, and finally, all of that takes place in an environment where humans are still human. And I'm not sure how many people in the room here have a tech degree. We struggle already with the conferencing system. How much do we struggle with algorithms and with distributed ledger programming and machine learning? All of that is, of course, advanced technology. That means our usual human means are limited when we have these things. This is just to show you the development from the centralized to the decentralized ledger. We have the concentrated ledger, like passports would usually function. Yeah, you have one authority that tells you that Dirk Zetzsche is Dirk Zetzsche and Ross Buckley is Ross Buckley, based on a very slim data set, which is usually taken at the time of your birth. Later on, we supplement it maybe with biometric data, and thereby it becomes more reliable. But in the beginning, this concentrated ledger is based on a very slim data set. Then the decentralized ledger has still 5, 6, 7 type of focus points, which can be attacked as points of failure. So here, the risk of attack is limited, divided by 5 here, and 5 focus points, of course. At the same time, when you attack one of these sub-points, you also erase 20% of the capacity. Yeah? So that means there may be some price to pay to get that type of security. When you know certainty, when we now get to the distributed ledger, we avoid many of these mistakes. We still have the full capacity of the ledger in place, but at the same time, the data is stored on all of these elements. Of course, data storage on many ends may also have privacy implications. So there's always an upside and downside when we look at this. On the other hand, it's very intriguing time for lawyers. So because we can be sure that this innovation cycle after a time also leads to certain difficulties. And right now, of course, the difficulties with cryptocurrencies is very obvious, with some of the largest crypto exchanges going bankrupt in the last 2 weeks. At the same time, this is not surprising. Yeah? No innovation comes without problems. And I think this is something that the lawyer always know. We can smile when innovation comes up because we know we will have work in 2 or 3 years from now. Yeah? So in this regard, this is just how innovation comes about, not so surprising. What I have now here as a slide is a little bit to show the complexity of these cryptocurrencies in context. This is a so-called DeFi stack. That's not my picture, but a picture I took from my colleague Fabian Scheer from the University of Basel. And he has basically put together the whole complexity of how a cryptocurrency is transferred and transaction today. You have in the lowest bottom what we call a settlement layer. That is basically where the crypto asset is created and transferred. And then there are a number of service layers on top. Each of them has a specific function, and the highest layer is basically the wallet. So you see that there are various protocols interacting. And of course, when many people interact, there's some miscommunication. And the same is true when protocols interact, because they're usually humanly programmed. And that, of course, means that there are malfunctions somewhere in the chain, that's for sure, which always, as a lawyer, prompts us to ask, who has to pay? Who is liable? So the good thing is we have always our questions and can deal with this innovation. Ladies and gentlemen, after this short way through FinTech, let me just speak about how FinTech came about. Because FinTech is essentially a response, or relatively, it's at least the latest FinTech is a response to the global financial crisis of 2008. But FinTech is not new. FinTech is ancient. The first FinTech was the abacus at the time of Hammurabi. You know, the thing with which you calculate? This was FinTech. Why? Because it allowed someone to use information and process information faster, thereby generate an advantage. More precise calculations of interest rates and similar things led to better calculation of the merchant. So you could see that fintech is basically hundreds of years old. Double bookkeeping is also a fintech invention of the 12th, 13th century. And here we see now when we go into the later parts, the 19th century, the telegraph is a huge fintech instrument, yeah, because it allowed almost real-time transmission of information. That is wonderful when you want to arbitrage on different markets at the same time. Yeah, the coffee price at the stock exchange in Amsterdam may differ from the one in New York, and then you can make a bargain. So all of that is, in a way, fintech. But of course, it's fintech 1.0. That means of the past. Then we have a stage in the second part of the 20th century where more modern elements came in, and usually we say that the automated teller machine, which allows real-time access to hard currency, was the beginning of the second stage of fintech, because this is novel. In the past, we had all paper-based, and you couldn't get access to cash. Here, for the first time, you can transmit between the banking system and the real-world system at almost zero cost. Then e-banking comes basically late. And the stage, shortly before the financial crisis, there were the first e-banking solutions, but back then it was just a niche market. But then came a heavy hit. 2007, the global financial crisis, was a crisis of many things. It was, on the one hand, a crisis of the traditional financial system, because some elements of this traditional financial system got out of hand. In this regard, in particular, the traditional risk management that you could at one single entity got out of hand. That was basically an insight of the past, and the term systemic risk have since ingrained in our heads. Another aspect, what failed in the global financial crisis, was the technology. There were risk management systems which were technically linked, but they were not sufficiently complex from an algorithm perspective to cover all the transactions that were there. So you could say that the models applied were too simple to cover the complexity of the products. And so certain ends, certain probabilities which never were supposed to happen materialized all of a sudden and brought the whole system down. But also, and that is a very important part, the regulators failed. Regulators were not able to see what was going on, and so they were not able to respond. And all of that led now to a response. And that response has two different prongs. On the one hand, we lost the trust in the brick and mortar institution, the banks, which allowed other young firms, the startups, to come out of the corner and take a bit of the lunch of the traditional banks. The second, and that is also very important, there was a regulatory response, which not also emphasized systemic risk ever since, but also which thought that maybe the supervisory system is too slow and must be technified and datafied. And that is then the emergence of RegTech, and I will come to that in a few minutes. So here you see that in a way, all of that took place in the so-called developed world, which is primarily the Western countries plus Australia and Singapore maybe. And the interesting aspect is that the so-called developing countries have caught up. They caught up on a different end because they came with mobile money operators and the respective use to an extent that today in Africa, mobile banking is in some parts more advanced than in many so-called developed countries. Yeah? So in Kenya, for instance, or in India, everyone is digital. China, everyone is digital to an extent that we would not achieve that in systems with more legacy banking systems where these type of old banks still have their market share. So the end is basically where we stand right now. We stand a bit of a brink either of new innovation or of collapse. That now depends on the perspective. We stand on the brink of collapse because we now at the end of 3 years of crisis, and we see the crisis also in the financial system. Phenomena like extremely high interest rates are a crisis phenomenon. The central banks don't know how to battle inflation, which is typically a typical banking problem, how to combat inflation. We have the problem that the means of the respective responses in the financial system are increasingly difficult to control. When you think of the pandemic, no one has foreseen the pandemic. No one has made reserves or put up reserves for the pandemic. That means we have now 2, 3, 4 years of constant crisis behind and ahead of us. And that, of course, brings up the question, what do we do in this situation? What is our recipe to combat these elements? Well, on the one hand, fintech was emerging out of the crisis, but it's also a response to a crisis, and we will see what that means. Well, it means, on the one hand, we have an abundance of regulation of traditional financial players, which almost suffocates the traditional banking sector. But on the other hand, we have become friendly to all these young firms, friendly to a point that regulators would never have been in the absence of the global financial crisis, because they thought, well, regulation has a purpose. And when we lift some of these rules for the small startups, we create risks. So all of a sudden, or basically as a result of the post-crisis reforms, came also a lot of new stuff which we have to deal with. I'm not sure whether you ever heard about regulatory sandboxes, innovation hubs, all these type of pro-regulatory means or pro-innovation means which serve only one purpose: bring the small players up to size as fast as possible so that they compete with the traditional financial institutions, which are in some respect too big to fail, and that is undesirable. Of course, regulators had also, when everything is datafied, to catch up, and that is happening with what we call RegTech. That is, regulatory technology stands for a type of datafication of supervision and regulation. And in this regard, for instance, automated reporting is here a good example. Just to give you a wonderful example, under the respective European rules on derivatives trading, fairly large-sized bank has to report 20 million transactions per day. How should that happen on a paper basis? It's impossible. When you're a derivatives trader, you have millions of these transactions in a couple of hours. And of course, for just booking them, you need to be fully automated. But for reporting these transactions to regulators, you also need to have a link to the regulators, basically like a constant data exchange. And it never stops because the banks are global, and that also means regulation must be global. And that shows the true impact of change on the banking system, but also on the regulatory system, which now tries to catch up with the datafied banks. And of course, maybe one other driver of RegTech was the heavy fines. The heavy fines that were imposed on the traditional banks up to last year. The total fines between 2008 and 2021 was $300 billion. The problem is not the size of the fine. The problem is the distribution of the fine. Whenever you're a large financial institution, you could almost book several billion of fines as normal cost of business, similar to staff cost. And what do you do with staff cost? If they're too high, you slash staff. What do you do with fines if they're too high? You try to slash fines. It's quite simple. So people, or the firms installed monitoring system to avoid these type of fines. And this is basically one driver of RegTech, just because fines have become a normal part of the business. And that was, of course, not the case before the global financial crisis. Getting a fine was a huge scandal. So people were resigning. Today, when you look at some of the very large financial institutions, when they get a fine, they probably just wink at their legal department and say, oh, another one. So that is, of course, not very good when you think in traditional enforcement means. But it means a lot as to the emergence of RegTech. When banks install compliance systems, look at how absurd this is. In the past, we thought that the bank managers themselves must comply. No, we outsource compliance control to the monitoring of tech devices, apparently assuming that the humans are too stupid to comply, or unwilling to comply. Both is a certain issue, because in the one case they're not qualified, in the other they're just maybe unfaithful. So both is not a very good idea and good news for the banking system. But having said that, what we see is in the emergence of the respective financial system, so I need the next slide, please. I need control back. Okay, good. So all of that, sorry, I control my slides. Sorry. Okay, good. So all of that has led to a state in which the financial system has become datafied, digitized, faster, disintermediated, but also more complex. Under these conditions, we are now, or we were confronted with a new phenomenon. The new phenomenon is a permanent crisis. The permanent crisis started probably late 2019 and has not left the planet ever since. The permanent crisis is now a kind of iteration of extraordinary events which have led to massive state intervention, which have led to entirely a rethinking of traditional economic thinking. In the past, state interference in markets was seen as something that needed justification. Today, it's basically a daily thing that politicians, regulators interfere in market transactions. That type of environment is entirely different than what capital market theory has told us about free choice, optimal allocation of resources, and so on. All of these things have been somehow forgotten. Instead, I don't want to be too provocative, but the degree of state steering we traditionally associated with totalitarian systems on less liberal systems. Yet, even the liberal, so-called liberal democracies are extremely interventionist these days, and that has several elements. In the pandemic, it was to support an economy which was under the immediate threat of an unknown disease. At the same time that we prevented shop owners from doing business, we needed to give them money to keep the shops open, which is a bit contradictory, you could say. Today, we do something similar. For instance, we use the financial system for warfare. When we cut off Russia or Iran from the financial system, we do that for a steering effect. Politicians believe they can discipline these countries by cutting them off from the financial streams and basically increase prices inside the economies. But what we do there is nothing else than a political decision is executed through the financial system. Another element of that is now, when you start thinking of it, sustainable finance. Sustainable finance is to use the financial markets to change human behavior so that they use less and less environmental resources. In the end, the thinking is the same, that the financial market is not only about efficient allocation of resources, but that it's a kind of steering effect for a lot of elements which are outside of the financial system. And this is a new thinking. And it requires from us to think what this means. Just to give you an idea about the traditional objectives of financial regulation. This is client and consumer protection, market integrity, market efficiency, and since the global financial crisis, systemic risk prevention. This is what financial regulation was about. This is why it was written in the beginning, to make sure that you can't defraud clients, that you can't steal. And if you steal, you go to jail. So this was the original idea. But the last 15 years have led to an expansion of objectives. And basically sustainability, steering effects outside of the economy by steering investments into apparently green products. Cybersecurity, national security. So that is, of course, an element that we want to have basically a secure national financial system. So we disallow certain players to play with our system. North Korea, I think, is ever out of the financial system for now more than 20 years because we don't want them in there. Openness to innovation is also a means external to the financial system. In the beginning, this is about something that should, for instance, be further within the educational system. So here you have a kind of purpose which is inherently outside, kind of externality, a public good, which shall now be furthered through the financial system. Of course, you can make the argument that efficient allocation of capital is also a public good. That's entirely for sure. But of course, expanding these type of public good ideas means that we load and load more and more objectives on the financial system. Financial inclusion is on the one hand a means to an end, but it's also something that we want to achieve for public good reasons. Because without financial inclusion, we have these players acting notoriously short-term. If you must fear when you have cash, mice and man, mice because they eat the money, man because they steal the money, then financial inclusion is a means to achieve storage of value. And when you store value, you can act and think long-term, because an investment good where the size is larger than your immediately daily income requires storage of money so that you can invest in it, because you need to pay off over time. So investment goods of a certain size require financial inclusion. And the latest technology usually outbeats the size of what you have at your hand every second. When you think about how you buy a computer, then you usually rely on storage means, either of your parents who have that money somewhere on the bank account, or you go to a credit provider, buy it and pay it off on the go. But both of that relies on the financial system, because a computer is usually more than what you earn per day. Very simple. And so investment, long-term investment requires financial inclusion. And so here, another means with which we burden the financial system. And the latest two is, of course, health crisis management. All of a sudden, the financial system must help us in the crisis, and our warfare. You see, the financial system has gone from relatively easy regulatory objectives to very complex, increasingly complex social, environmental, political matters. All of that shall be achieved by the same regulators. Have you spoken to regulators in the last years? They come to me and ask, I studied finance. What do I know about health? What do I know about hard science? What do I know about greenhouse gas emission, other than what everyone can read in the press, and I shall regulate it? Of course, these people are under enormous stress right now, because we demand nothing less from them than solving all the problems of the world. Nothing less than squaring the circle. Of course, in this regard, what are the counter-arguments to widen the regulatory objective of financial law in this way? On the one hand, it doesn't seem to work. The crypto winter is an element that shows that maybe regulation has failed. So maybe regulation shouldn't be the answer to something when they're already overwhelmed within their own service level. So, well, my point is the crypto winter is very interesting for us. We will write probably 10 papers about it, but the crypto winter is irrelevant for the world, because people who had speculated lose their money now, but by all numbers that I know, none of that is relevant. It is pocket cash as compared to the world economy. So the crypto winter is a nice study for law professors, but not so much for the world. So that maybe it's even healthy to have a crypto winter, because it means that less people throw their money at untested business models. So the question is instead much more pressing. Do we ask too much from the regulatory system? Is that desirable to widen these prospective objectives, or should we just turn back to our original four means? I think the train has left the station. Politicians have found too much appeal in using the financial system for everything. Just think about what happened in the COVID crisis. First, they shut down the firms, then they pumped money in the firms, and of course, the central banks were asked to create that money. So this is nothing else than basically using the financial system to kill a cat that you have first killed yourself. That you could say is contradictory to a certain extent. You wouldn't have that problem if you hadn't implemented the measures, the lockdown measures and so on. But once it is there, you turn to the financial system, the very financial system that many politicians wished dead in 2008. In 2008, when you read the press, everyone wanted to put the bankers on the guillotine. 15 years later, they wished they could reanimate and have more bankers because they had solved their problems. So this type of aspect, of course, prompts the question, do we ask too much from the financial system? Yes, we ask a lot. But, well, if we use it, the question is not, can we put the genie back into the bottle. It is already out. The question is, if it's out, what can we do? What are the preconditions? This is a question we need to ask. Under which condition can this work? Because it's unlikely that the train will move back into the station. And in this regard, we need to see this as an open transformation. We can now argue against it in very scholarly journals, but no one will follow us. So the question is not, can we move this back, but under which condition can our financial system survive? And here it's obvious that we need to put the regulators in a position that they can address this transformation and think about in which way there is a division of labor between the financial system, which is a cure for all right now, and maybe other type of regulators, for instance, of environmental agencies and so on. And of course, the counter argument against this is also, will the main regulatory objectives suffer? Absolutely, if regulators shall act with the same type of resources. So when we expand the mandate, we need to expand financial regulation, and we need to expand the resources, and we need to think about what these type of additional rules mean. Just to give you an example from sustainability, when we think that we all shall drive electric vehicles, I don't drive electric vehicle because I think it is very, very bad for biodiversity and very bad for social inclusion. But let's just assume an electric vehicle is deemed sustainable. So in this regard, if credit is financing traditional fossil fuel vehicles, can we still swap financial flows over the border in the same way? Or do we need new ways of cross-border finance where we exclude the evil fossil fuel credits from being swapped at the capital markets? So bringing in all these type of alternative thoughts in the financial system requires us also to rethink a lot of elements, including the free flow of capital. Because otherwise, the capital from bad investments will eat up the capital from the so-called good investments, because the good investments are a bit more expensive. And you can see this right now. The most profitable investments of the last 2 years was oil and gas. Very much against sustainability, yeah? Because there's simply no wisdom in the market in that sense that oil and gas cannot be profitable. Oil and gas is very profitable. So if we want them to be out of the market in line with sustainability dimensions, we need to think how we get there. And traditional regulatory means will not lead us there. So it's just meaning we're coming up with entirely new questions, and these questions are entirely not addressed. And this is what we try in our paper. And I try to give you just 4 little insights. In the paper that we've written, we come up with basically 4 broad demands. And these 4 broad demands, of course, in a paper of 30 pages, you can't answer all these big world questions, but you can, first of all, say, yes, finance has so many more mandates. How do we deal with this? And here we expanded as one thing, the principle of systemic risk into a broader principle of resilience. Resilience is one of the key aspects that we must achieve, and resilience can be threatened from various means. It cannot only be a bankruptcy of the bank that threatens the financial stability, but also the bankruptcy of the health system, yeah, or maybe also the bankruptcy of the political system, as in the war. Yeah, so resilience is now a new standard, replacing the minor view of financial systemic risk of the past. Another aspect of our new financial system is what I refer to as inclusion. Why inclusion? Well, because if we want to use a financial system for crisis management, everyone who is not in the financial system will be deprived of crisis management. So it is crucial to understand that we need the financial system for crisis management. So everyone should participate. And that means bank accounts, for instance, for free for those who are not in the position to have bank accounts. And in every country of the world, there are more or less excluded people. So for instance, in the so-called developed countries, you have usually some groups that are usually not present. In Europe, elderly folks. Digital banking is everywhere, but the elderly folks are not part of the financial system anymore. My mother is 85. She regularly yells at the ATM, but that doesn't change the world. She's still out. So in this regard, we need to think about ways how to include all parts of society, immigrant part of society, refugees, elderly folks, digital, unsophisticated people. So there's a lot what we need to think about when we want to use the financial system in this new transformative manner. The next aspect, we should always think about the sustainability. The solutions that we apply shouldn't be ending tomorrow. Short-term has always long-term cost. So whatever solution we apply must have a certain sustainability duration. Sustainability meant not as kind of green, but sustainability in a kind of long-term orientation in everything what we do, because short-term fixes usually have an enormous cost. And for instance, you could say that the current hyperinflation that we have may also be the result of certain short-term fixes somewhere else in the political system. And finally, since we don't have the solutions for many of the problems right now, we must focus on how we finance innovation, because much of the problems that we have can only be solved by innovation. Very good example is here COVID. COVID in 2020 was an unknown disease. Probably today it's the best researched disease ever, because we had no other disease in the world where almost 6 billion people were put to testing. 6 out of 7 billion were put to testing. And vaccination. So probably it's the best researched disease ever. So here innovation has solved the problem. We are almost back in the state of normal. Very few countries accept it. But in this regard, these 4 parameters must be pursued by regulators to come to a solution. So what does it mean in terms of what regulators means? Of course, digitalization is key. Otherwise, it doesn't work. Simply because we need to bridge the distances and so on. That's for sure. But what else comes to it? Capacity building. We need to build new hard science capacities, social science capacities in the regulators. Maybe they're not the best to do it, but they're the only ones who do it. So if no one does it, someone needs to pick it up. And here the financial regulators may be useful. Then openness to innovation is for sure. The regulator must be as open to innovation as the overall system, because otherwise innovation doesn't take place, and we need to finance innovation, and that's for sure. Then I think what is really, really crucial is that our risk assessments move away from pure financial risk to what we call interdisciplinary risk assessments, because the risks that hit today the financial system come outside. The sources are outside of the financial system, but hit the financial system. In the past, we just looked at the banks and asked, is your banking book in order? Today, we need to say that the risks come outside of the financial system, onside the banking books. And it is amazing how resilient the financial system is in light of the many, many impacts that it had to feel over the last years. Then the word that I love, and I hope that it is understood in the right manner, regulators need to make rules following a sandbox thinking. What is that? In the past, and in particular, when you see that in private law, you write a law in the year of 1900, like in the German Civil Code, and 80–90% of that stays unamended for the next 120 years. That was lawmaking of the past. So that's also the reason why many private lawyers still to this day study Roman law. 2000 years. Well, I don't think that the lawmaking of today will result in rules that have that duration. Quite the opposite. Much of what we do is try and error. That means we need to try to fix and correct when we see that the result is undesirable. That also means for us lawyers that it may not be worthwhile to write 1,000 dissertations about some sentences in the law, because the law may be amended faster before you have handed in the dissertation to your committee. So it's important to move towards a type of flexible approach to the existence of regulation, and maintaining regulation may not be something to be an argument in itself. Change is the new normal rather than persistence of rules. Of course, that means change of transformation, cost of transformation. So we need to be proportionate in what we change and what we do maintain. And then the last point, and this will be a huge challenge, much of what we do in the financial system is to finance cross-border business, cross-border trade. when we now load all these type of additional objectives onto the financial system, it will be imperative to think about what this makes to our cross-border flows of capital. What does it make to a prospectus? When an Australian company wants to have money in London, it writes a prospectus according to a certain style. That style guide is agreed on by IOSCO regulators, and you can take money when you follow that style from London investors, from European investors. That's crucial. So the European investors can diversify by opting into Australian companies. Australian companies have a larger pool of capital. Regardless of all this type of additional loads onto the financial system, we believe it is crucial to find and maintain, nevertheless, some openness that allows basically to use the global capital markets, because otherwise the risk of innovation in each specific country will be concentrated, and when it fails, this type of risk concentration will play out in disastrous cost for the respective society. So we need to diversify away the risk of all our fixes and errors and undertakings that we have here. I'm at the end of my presentation. Let me just conclude. We need to understand that finance has turned from a problem child to our best crisis mechanism in the world that exists today. Our crisis management perspective asks us to understand that a digital financial system is the best horse in the stable because we can reach the people in the fastest way. Here again, the financial crisis of 2008 didn't repeat itself in March 2020 because within milliseconds, the central banks intervened and made sure that the dip that we had there mid-March was rectified by billions and billions and billions of central bank money just kicking in because the regulatory system was almost real time. That was a wonder that COVID didn't hit the capital markets 20 years before. That would have probably been a downturn at the capital markets, and that means the end of refinancing of firms, because a downturn of the capital market means recapitalization is extremely expensive. So in this regard, we had seen that this almost real-time regulation that we had created after the financial crisis really worked. But now in an entirely different environment than we thought, because everyone thought we need to do it to save the banks from their own mistakes. But here, that wasn't the case. We used the banks against external influences, and it worked. So in this regard, the financial regulation must change to understand that this new function of the system, not preventing risks from within the financial system, but using the financial system against risks from the outside. Also, this requires careful regulatory companionship. We cannot just leave the regulators alone. What can we do? Well, we need to enhance capacity beyond the core objectives. We need to build entirely new departments inside the regulators. We need to make sure that all of this becomes interdisciplinary and that basically insights from the outside world also impacts financial regulation. We will probably need to make sure that every entity in the financial system is open to innovation. And finally, we need to move from a regulatory perfection standard to sandbox thinking with a lot of fixes, a lot of changes, well, and also a lot of work for lawyers. With that, I'm at the end. Finally, nothing of this works when we concentrate the risks inside our jurisdictions. So cross-border harmonization, mutual recognition schemes, global trade will be key to find and finance the best solution in this regard. I'm at the end of my presentation, and I'm very happy to receive your questions. Thank you very much.